Hey guys, alright, this is an overview of the terrain editing, sculpting, painting, creation, and joining tools that we now have available for use in the Unity editor. So this is basically just a toolkit that's going to help make it a little bit easier to sort of arbitrarily position parts of a town or to make paths and stuff and actually see how things are going to look, A, in the game engine, and B, just as a holistic environment, because we're doing everything or trying to do as much as we can in the editor now, so this should be very helpful. Just want to go over the steps of the process. We're going to come back to the screen a lot. This screen, you should probably like write everything on it down because this is like the cheat sheet for how to do this, and it's not a difficult process, but it's also not like at any given step you need to know what the next one is or you want to know what to do. So the three steps are to place some ideally primitive planes around, and these are going to basically rough out the area that your terrain is actually going to be built on, and it doesn't have to form a square or even a rectangle. It can be any arbitrary collection you want. Get to that in a moment. When you're done with that, you want to convert all the planes into this grid-aligned mesh, and that's basically the conversion from arbitrary Unity planes to a perfectly grid-aligned sort of arbitrary mesh in Unity, and then you want to actually sculpt and paint it. And then sort of there's some details here about the specifics of each of these tasks, which is not really worth getting into right now. So let's go over to Unity and take a look at what this all actually means. So let's place a couple planes. We're going to go to Game Object. We'll just do one to start plane, and you can see that actually our little dude seems to have sunk here. We don't really want that. Oh, whoa. There we go. And oh, actually, no, you know what? I thought that looked weird. It just lied. Get this at 0. Get our little dude back down to 1. Alright, and then we're going to scale this up quite a bit. You can see here's that little reference guy. So we're going to make this a little big, just kind of non-completely trivial. We'll go to AE, and we're going to go to Meshes to Grid Mesh, and this is what's going to turn. See, this thing isn't really grid aligned at all. This is just some arbitrary size. As I scale this, those verts aren't snapping to anything. They're just, wherever they are, and there aren't very many. So we're going to go to Meshes to Grid Mesh. What this will do is it will create one mesh that fully encloses this mesh. So if it's at some odd, size or whatever, it will bump it up to the next grid cell based on some grid size. Now, we're usually using a vertex density of 2 meters per polygon, basically. And so that's this grid size thing here. We can also assign the layer when we do this. If we want to always use layer 12 for terrain, you can just put 12 in here. I'm going to leave this at the defaults, hit create. It'll take a couple seconds, and there it goes. It made something. So we're going to delete our source plane, and we have left behind this thing now, this much higher density mesh, which we can now use to start painting. Let's do that. We're going to go to the terrain editor. I'm going to work on positions right away. Click. This is the user interface for this thing. This terrain editor pops up. You click on Paint Vertex Positions, which is basically sculpt the geometry. First thing you need to do is to lock the object for painting. The first time you do it, it will pop up this little annoying note that you need to add a mesh collider. This is for legacy support. Don't worry about it. Just close that, and then you're good. So set the brush radius up quite a bit. We'll set the strength up quite a bit just to do some rough strokes and show how this thing works in general. Move this aside. And, the operation, you just send here's a little note. Press plus minus to push in, out, backspace to smooth. The way Unity works, you can't like click and drag like you would in a normal program. What you do is you move the mouse around, and depending on what key you're holding down, it has a different effect. Nothing if nothing's being pressed down. So plus is a push operation, like this. Minus, well, I guess actually it's push positive. Minus is push negative, which will sink things into the ground. And then backspace smooths, has an averaging effect on all the verts that are currently selected, or in the selection reticle. So let's just go around again and do some kind of broad strokes. Just rough this terrain up a little bit. And okay. Now you might notice that, okay, so like this is working, but it's creating a very, it's sort of like a cellulite, or cellulose looking lump here. So we might want a little bit more detail. One thing we can do for that is there's this little checkbox down here for invert fall off, dome or cusp. This is, I don't know, this is a weird little UI element. I probably need to redo this. It's not very intuitive. But anyway, if you put this on cusp, what happens, you can clearly see here, if I just hold this plus key down, it has this kind of radial fall off, and it's just like a paintbrush in Photoshop. But if I put this on cusp and then hold the mouse key down, it has the opposite effect. It starts making these little craters. And one thing that this is very useful for, and put this back, and let's just start adding these back down a little bit so I have a flatter surface to work on. One thing cusp is useful for is just kind of roughing the hell out of a surface. You take a high strength make sure it's on cusp. So the thing about the cusp is that it doesn't normalize, it doesn't do any averaging at the edge, so it's going to create a real spiky edge. So if you just kind of run that around in rings, you know, it sort of nicely pocks up the terrain a little bit, makes it a bit more interesting. Now the problem, of course, is that from the perspective of our little guy, this doesn't really like look super good. So what you need to do after you do a cusp pass like that is turn cusp off, set the strength down quite a lot, the brush size up quite a lot, and do another normalizing averaging pass. This will, you know, obviously it's taking some of the visual interest away, but it's giving you much cleaner geometry that will actually look like something to the player. Let's just move this up a little bit. Now you can see from roughly that scale, that's a much nicer effect, and still not, you know, flat boring. So that cusp thing, although not especially useful by itself unless you really needed like an ugly crater, can be very helpful for quickly roughing up the terrain a little bit to make it look more interesting. Okay, so that's one terrain object. Let's delete that and let's try something a little bit more, well, not necessarily more interesting, but let's try something different. Go over here, and we're going to create under plane, and this time I'm going to make this a bit larger, but this time I'm going to rotate this one and sort of scale it arbitrarily. Let's pretend that we were doing like long corridors in a dungeon and they needed to be, you know, kind of an earthen roughed up floor, and in which case you might need a couple of these at, you know, some arbitrary locations. You know, something that's not super beautiful, but it could be something like that. You select all three and then go to, actually I'm going to just fatten this one up a little bit so it's slightly more reasonable. Okay, now you would select all three. AE meshes to grid mesh, same density. Take its sweet time. Okay, and you can see what it's done is it's created kind of like a ugly pixelated version basically of that collection of geometry. You may notice that this the pivot basically is sitting way out here, and that's because it's at the base of the bounding box describing this whole composite. It sort of had to be somewhere. I didn't really want it to be centered. This is more useful to have it at a corner for making sure that it grid aligns with other things. So, okay, so now we have this, and it's just the same thing. Now you go in here, it's going to yell about the thing, don't worry about it, and then you just go ahead and paint, and turn your strength way back up to, you know, get this a bit more interesting. And there you go, very easy to paint even just completely arbitrary meshes, you know, from this join. And this would actually be a little bit tricky to do in something like Studio Max. I mean, you could do it. Obviously, you could just like delete the polys you don't want from a gigantic object, but this is actually faster, so it's pretty interesting. Okay, actually, while we're on, I'll go back to a normal, regular, basic little plane. Put this somewhere, zoom in. And just sort of scale this up a little bit. This one I'm not going to make too big. Actually, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller even. And meshes to grid mesh, blah, blah, blah. Delete this guy. Go over here. And now I want to do the vertex color painting, a lock for painting. And if you click on See Vertex Colors, it will actually, now it's going to complain about the thing. It'll jump in this example project, it will assign our internal AE debug vertex RGB with the shader attached to it. What I found is that when I copied these assets to an additional external project, this shader didn't necessarily come along for the ride. Well, it came along, but when you applied this material, everything showed up hot magenta, which is, you know, my shader's missing color. If you were to click on this list, okay, unlock object, that's one thing I mentioned. When an object is locked, this panel, the terrain editor UI panel itself, steals focus all the time. So like if you want to change this color, you can't. You notice this window closes because this panel keeps stealing it. If I unlock the object and then click on this, everything works as normal. So again, this object is locked, object is locked, and I tried to change my shader, can't do it. Unlock, now everything works again. If you click on, you know, like over here, See Vertex Colors or See Blend Shader, and it turns magenta, unlock the object, go to the material, go to the shader, and select from the AE menu the correct shader. In this case, it's Debug Vertex Colors RGB. The other one is this Terrain Blend RGBA. Those are really the two that matter for terrain work. So we're locked for painting, and we're going to fill it green. This is actually a commercial plugin. This panel right here is a commercial plugin called Vertex Painter, and it's a little bit weird, sort of unintuitive. If you want to flood this object green, for instance, to kind of start your terrain painting, you can uncheck everything, set green to run, and hit apply random colors, and that just makes the whole thing green. I think that this is the probability of a color being used, and so when they're all set to 0 but green, then it just makes everything that. So to make everything paintable again, and now we're going to paint red with a much smaller brush radius, but also a very high strength. And actually we're going to just go over here to the blend shader, and you can see that here we have this, you know, green grass sort of color. And now we're going to paint. You paint, by the way, the color, the key for activating the paintbrush is command. So whereas it was plus minus and backspace for sculpting, it's just command for vertex painting. So we're going to start painting, and this is a little boring because that appears to be some other, oh, here we go, here's the path. So let's make a couple paths here, maybe something going off this way, and like that, and put a little blob here in the middle. Okay, hard to see maybe a little bit, but there's some, you know, path. And let's also put a little stone area, at least inside this one. We'll just do stone. It's definitely not beautiful. Okay, great. Unlock the object, switch over to paint positions. Now what we can do now is we can base our terrain on some of this information. I'll lock for painting, take a slightly larger brush radius, actually significantly larger brush radius, larger strength, and just start elevating things between the paths. Let's take a little bit more. You know, just something. I've got the path there. It's not good. It can be easily flattened. And then this is the interesting one because now we have this sort of rock texture on the outside here. And I'm just going to smooth this over. Try to... Generally speaking, things being wavy but mostly flat is basically correct because the scale is quite dramatic. You know, when you're down here, you really don't need this to look like the Himalayas for it to be interesting to players. And if it is in fact the Himalayas, then obviously it's not going to be much fun to actually navigate. Let's get our path a little bit flatter here. Maybe push it down. Oh, oh, watch out for that. The tools are a little bit imprecise. There you go. Interesting. Something like that. So there, now we have this path and a little rock wall on the side, and you know, it's good. It's an intuitive thing. Now, okay, so let's say we have this terrain, and I want to really mess this edge up a little bit. Now, what happens when I want to extend this? Let's say I realize, oh, you know, I need another one over here on the side. So I'm going to duplicate this object, Control D. I'm going to drag it over here, and it needs to be lined up pretty much exactly. Which, what does that look like, 54? I wasn't really paying attention to the size. Yeah, it seems good. Okay, so now one thing though is that when you're painting and doing this kind of mesh sculpting stuff, you'll notice if I just open the terrain editor right now, go positions, lock for painting, and just put this thing up here, and I start painting, let's say like here in this corner, oh, it affects both. This mesh is being controlled as well. We don't really want that. And the reason that's happening is because this mesh, if you look at it, this is set to this index mesh, and this is a unity assigned ID, but basically this object is pointing to this mesh. Because this one's a duplicate, it also points to the same mesh, and we don't want that. So what we do is we go to our game object menu, and we go to deep copy game object. This is an AE script, so this won't be there by default. Click on that. You have to make sure to actually copy that. Delete the original, and now you'll have this final clone, and it's pointing to the copy of that underlying mesh. So now, if we were to paint, go over here, go to the terrain editor, paint positions, lock. Brush is really small. We go over here, then we paint now. this is the same corner. You want to just normalize some stuff. You'll notice no effect on the other corner. No problem. Now we have separate meshes. Okay. But now we have this issue where I wanted to keep painting my terrain, but it's going to be basically impossible to have these two joined here at the seam. We can do it a little bit, and it's worth doing it a little tiny bit. We're just going to lock for painting and just try to get these into generally like the same ballpark. Something like that seems reasonable. All right, there we go. not miles off. What we do is we go to Game Object, Create Other, Cube. This is another tool that we have. It's kind of a little weird. This cube is going to define an area where we're going to try to average the position of vertices within the cube, basically on both meshes. So let's actually just do this manually. It's going to be much easier. Set its height to 20 meters and the z-scale to, I guess, 60. I'm sorry, that would be probably more like 100. In fact, let's just make it 120 because I'm an idiot. All right. And I like this AE grid cube. Just put that on there. It just makes it a little bit easier to make sure that the vertices in this seam are inside this object, which they clearly are. You can see that seam is right inside there. Okay, great. So now we select all three, and actually this should just, for sake of looking right, be a little bit higher. We go to AE and we go to Join Terrain Edges, and you need this box. It needs to be called, it doesn't have to be called a cube, but it has to have the name cube somewhere in it. But if you just create a default cube primitive and scale it and put it over here, you're golden. That's all you really have to do. I do advise putting an interesting shader on it so you can make sure you're looking at the right points. But anyway, select the two terrains, select the cube, and go to AE, Join Terrain Edges. This fall off value is how far into the mesh it's going to go and try to average positions. You remember the mesh was something around 108 meters across. So we're actually going to set our fall off to be about half of that. So we're going to set to 54. It doesn't have as dramatic an effect as you'd think. In fact, I'm not sure why its effect is as weak as it is. But anyway, then we're going to go to Create. And we'll hide our cube here. And you see that it did join the seam here. Now, there's a little bit of an issue, which is that, of course, our vertex colors don't line up particularly well. And also, we have a UV offset problem, where even where the texture is the same, it doesn't quite line up. You can, because everything is based on a grid, excuse me, it is possible to fix that, but you have to do it manually. That's something we can... I wouldn't really worry about that when you're just roughing out terrain. I just like the fact that there's no giant explicit... There's a seam, but there's no gap that people can fall through. The seam can eventually be hidden. There are problems like here where, you know, this one has blue going over here, and this one obviously is green. If you look at the underlying vertex colors, just drag this shader out here. You can kind of see what's going on there where it's not really ever going to look particularly right. You can fix that manually again. And eventually this tool will be better and will actually make these seams look very good, but for now this is kind of what we're looking at. So let me put the RGBA back on. And that's pretty much it. Those are the tools. This is kind of, well, the specular on this shader is a little marshmallowy and kind of weird, but otherwise, those are the tools. Those are how you use them. This seam thing should be able to work around corners also. If you have like 3 and you have 2 boxes, it should handle that case. So if it doesn't, just make sure to save everything before you get into that. Oh, speaking of saving, one thing. When the terrain editor is open, you'll notice there's this Save Changes to Mesh option. We're going to put this over here. Click on Save Changes to Mesh. What that does is in this terrain editor, there's a folder in the hierarchy over here, the project folder for terrain editor. It has a thing called Vertex Painted Meshes, and you'll see this was, whatever, 6764, here we go. By saving this now, this has actually been saved to disk, which means that if, God forbid, anything were to happen at this point that destroys this mesh, you can always have it just point to this one. And one way to make sure that that's possible is after you save it, deep copy it, and destroy the original. So now it's pointing to a clone of that mesh. So now if you do something terrible to it, if I go in here and I, you know, start terrain painting, so I go in here, lock, do these horrible things, you know, and it's like, oh, I didn't mean to do that because I accidentally affected the path as well, so now the path is complete nonsense. How do I fix this easily? Well, because I cloned this and made sure to save the original, I can just go back. Well, that's certainly a skill. Here we go. I can just go back to the original through the mesh selection menu, and there we go. Undone. No problem. So, you know, this is kind of advanced, but clever use of saving and deep copying and re-referencing can sort of provide some undo functionality, which this normally does not have, so that can be very helpful. All right, so that's it. Please find me on Instant Messenger if there's any questions, or, you know, Skype, call, whatever, and that should be good. This thing always eats the last 2 seconds of audio, so I'm going to end on a completely fake humming.